1874, women's suffrage was the topic at Cheney Hall, with activists Susan B. Anthony, 1820 to 1906, and Isabella Beecher Hooker, 1822 to 1907, speaking out for voting rights. Susan B. Anthony had been arrested, found guilty, and fined in 1872 for voting in a presidential election, and in the next couple of years traveled extensively to promote equal voting rights. Time magazine later called her 1873 speech one of the top 10 greatest speeches of all time. In recognition of these two famous civil rights workers, we're inviting you now to recognize this historic occasion. We'll start with a vintage song from our town troubadour, Bill Ludwig.
Good afternoon. The song I'm going to play is a song called Daughters of Freedom, The Ballot Be Yours. The words were written by a lyricist named George Cooper, and the music was written by Edwin Christie. Songs this old are not always able to be specifically dated, but it was written sometime between 1870 and 1885, which is a pretty wide range.
Daughters of freedom, rise in your might, march to the watchwords, justice and right. Why will ye slumber? Wake, awake. Low on your legions, light doth break. Sunder the fetters custom hath made. Come from the valley, hill and glade. Daughters of freedom, the truth marches on. Yield not the battle till ye have won. Heed not the corner to day by day. Clouds of oppression roll away. Sunder the fetters custom hath made. Come from the valley, hill and glade. Daughters of freedom, the ballot be yours. Wield it with wisdom, hopes it secures. Rights that are equal, this ye claim. Right by your God and fair your fame. Sunder the fetters custom hath made. Come from the valley, hill and glade. Come from the valley, hill and glade.
Thank you, Bill. Bill Ludwig, our town troubadour. I'm David Garnes. I'm a member of the board here at the Little Theatre of Manchester, and some of you may recognize me from the lunchtime lectures that we do here, and I also teach some classes at Manchester Community College, and I live in Manchester. So my job here today is to give you a little history of this building, of Cheney Hall. A bit of history about this beautiful building. Built by Cheney Brothers Company after the Civil War as a community cultural center and theater. The hall was designed by artist and architect C.H. Hammett Billings in French Second Empire style, featuring a mansard roof, brick and brownstone arches, tall windows, carved oak and chestnut trim. You might want to take a closer look at this building, afterwards or as we're speaking here, because it really is it was built with great care and accuracy in terms of the Second Empire French style, which was a very popular style during the Victorian era, which of course this was. Another good example of French Empire building is the Goodspeed Opera House in East Haddam. Inside our building, there's a magnificently restored 1866 E and G.G. Hook tracker organ built into the rear wall of the stage. The hall saw many uses. It was a theater, there were lectures, high school graduations, boxing exhibitions, church services, farmers markets, Memorial Day speeches were given here, banquets were held, meetings of fraternal organizations, and notably, and I think perhaps most interestingly, although sadly, as a hospital during the 1918 flu epidemic. That's a very interesting time to read about, and there is a fair amount of documentation about how it served as a hospital. There was no local hospital at that point here in Manchester. From the 1920s to the 1970s, the hall served as a fabric showroom for silk and other textile products. How many of you here remember when it was that? So, a lot of you. Yeah, a lot of you. I hear that all the time from people when we talk about Cheney Hall. But then, in the late 1970s, Cheney Hall was virtually abandoned. By the late 1970s, the hall was actually threatened with demolition due to neglect. But in 1978, the Cheney Brothers National Historic Landmark District was created. And it was placed on the National Register of Historic Places. This was the impetus for preservation of the mill area and also of Cheney Hall. In 1982, the hall was donated to the town, and the Cheney Hall Foundation, which exists today, was created by Manchester's Board of Directors to restore and operate the building. Little Theatre of Manchester was approached in the early 1980s, and in terms of, would you like to consider this as a, if not permanent, a long-term location for your theater. And we assisted in fundraising for the restoration of the building. So, 124 years after the original dedication, Cheney Hall was rededicated on June 29, 1981, and the Little Theater moved here that same year. So, a little bit about the theater that now is, a lot of people in Manchester would identify this building with the Little Theater, although there are other things that go on as well. In addition to our main stage subscription series, number one. Number two, our evenings at 7 readings, which are semi-staged readings of plays that are either not suitable for upstairs for our main productions or that we're considering for our main productions. And then also our lunchtime lectures, which occur on the Wednesday preceding the week of opening for each of our productions. Those are broadcast live on Facebook and stay on Facebook if you cannot attend those. However, we also act, as most of you probably know, as the rental agent for other cultural, business, civic, and private functions. So our final production for this season is Mamma Mia for 3 weekends in November, and our subscription series for our 60th anniversary year. You see, we existed in other venues before we came here, so this is actually 60 years. Now, however, we are going to look back to an event in January 1874. Now, this would be 9 years after the end of the American Civil War, just to place that in context. 2 famous speakers came to Cheney Hall. I'd now like to ask one of those speakers, Isabella Beecher Hooker, to tell us a little bit about herself.
Thank you very much. Well, I am delighted to be here today with you at Cheney Hall. I am Isabella Beecher Hooker. I was born in 1822 in Litchfield, Connecticut, the daughter of Reverend Lyman Beecher and his second wife, Harriet. While we moved several times in my youth, I returned to Connecticut at the age of 15 for schooling, and then I met and eventually married my husband, the attorney John Hooker. We have 3 children, and we reside at the colony of Nook Farm in Hartford. My husband and I are both longtime supporters of the abolition movement, and I believe that the emancipation of women must be the great next step in national progress.
Yes.
I have become increasingly involved in the struggle for women's rights, for I believe that women will raise the moral level of politics and bring a motherly wisdom to the affairs of government.
Yes.
Thank you. 5 years ago, I had the honor of calling the first convention in the state of Connecticut for discussing the questions of women in government, and I founded the Connecticut Women's Suffrage Association. The following year, in 1870, I drafted and presented a bill to our Connecticut legislature to provide equal property rights to married women. While it has not yet succeeded, I continue to introduce this bill every year, and I plan to persist until passage is achieved. For every woman has rights as a human being first, which belong to no sex, and ought to be as freely conceded to her as if she were a man. Thank you. In 1871, I organized at my own expense the Washington Convention on Women's Suffrage for the purpose of calling the attention of Congress to the fact that women were already citizens of the United States under the Constitution, interpreted by the Declaration of Independence, and only need recognition from that body to become voters. I opened a large volume inviting women to sign a declaration supporting this fact, and during that winter, hundreds of autographed signatures on little slips of white paper came from all parts of the country and were pasted into this volume with tearful eyes. It is an honor to come to South Manchester to speak at Cheney Hall and to join my friend, Susan B. Anthony. Susan is 2 years older than I and has worked steadily for equal voting rights for many years. Susan was arrested, found guilty, and fined in 1872 for voting in a presidential election, and since then has traveled extensively to promote equal rights. Susan, please tell us more about voting rights for women.
Thank you, Regina. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Friends and fellow citizens, I stand before you tonight under indictment for the alleged crime of having voted at the last presidential election without having a lawful right to vote. It shall be my work this evening to prove to you that in thus voting, I not only committed no crime, but instead simply exercised my citizens' rights guaranteed to me and all United States citizens by the national Constitution beyond the power of any state to deny. The preamble of the federal Constitution says, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice and domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States." It was we, the people, not we, the white male citizens, nor yet the male citizens, but we, the whole people, who formed the Union. And we formed it not to give the blessings of liberty, but to secure them, not to the half of ourselves and the half of our posterity, but to the whole people, women as well as men. And it is a downright mockery to talk to women of their enjoyment of the blessings of liberty while they are denied the use of the only means of securing them provided by this Democratic Republican government, the ballot. Yes. For any state to make sex a qualification that must ever result in the disenfranchisement of one entire half of the people is to pass a bill of attainder or an ex post facto law, and is therefore a violation of the supreme law of the land. Yes. By it, the blessings of liberty are forever withheld from women and their female posterity. To them, this government has no just powers derived from the consent of the governed. To them, this government is not a democracy. It is not a republic. It is an odious aristocracy, a hateful oligarchy of sex, the most hateful aristocracy ever established on the face of the globe, an oligarchy of wealth where the rich govern the poor. Yes, that's right. An oligarchy of learning where the educated govern the ignorant might be endured. But this oligarchy of sex, which makes father, brothers, husbands, sons, the oligarchs over the mother and sisters, the wife and daughters of every household, which ordains all men sovereigns, all women subjects, carries dissension, discord, and rebellion into every home of the nation. Webster defines a citizen to be a person in the United States, entitled to vote and hold office. The only question left to be settled now is, are women persons? And I hardly believe any of our opponents will have the hardihood to say they are not. Being persons then, women are citizens, and no state has a right to make any law or to enforce any old law that shall abridge their privileges or immunities. Hence, every discrimination against women in the constitutions and laws of the several states is today null and void.
Excellent.
To the editor of the Hartford Daily Current, Manchester, January 25, 1874. You know, there are to be, perhaps you have already advertised, a series of 18 women's suffrage meetings in the state. Well, the first one was held in our South Village Saturday evening. The posters were sent to me to put up, but got stuck somewhere on the way. Posters, thinks I to myself. Have we got to go over the performance again with a platform of swell vice presidents to simulate popularity? I have been stumping my district lately upon school business and seen with my own eyes that the bottom of opposition to women's voting was gone. Only some William Tecumseh Sherman in petticoats was wanting to drive through the state to show it. I don't say mine that our women talk of their political freedom to everybody. The Southern Negroes did not hope for civil liberty before everyone, you know. Hunting for posters dampened my ardor. It seemed a drag to get to the meeting. Rather stay at home and make a pop gun for the small boy. But the resolution of the mistress surprised me. She was determined to go, and I must go too. The children would have to do well enough without us. She marched off to a neighbor's and got the loan of a kindly big boy to keep house for the evening. The crush of antique narrow-gauge wagons in the village horse sheds proved at an early hour that we had no need for posters. The people came out in force. No bother with vice presidents or ceremony. Only two women on the platform, Mrs. Hooker and Miss Anthony. I have been prejudiced against Miss Anthony. The newspapers so belied and be-Susaned her, who could help being prejudiced? She turns out just such an intelligent, straightforward, honest woman as every man would like to leave in charge of his concerns while he gallops away upon business and legislative adventures. We could make money like smoke with plenty of such capable help, content to stay at home and ask no questions. Miss Anthony began in her girlhood by inquiring of her cotton-spinning father why, if Sally Jane Somebody was really the mainstay of the weave room, he didn't make Sally mistress of the work with full pay. She has continued this sort of questioning for 20 years, asking a more equal chance for women, as John Adams' wife did 100 years ago. Her talk is as plain and trustworthy as herself. Argument, anecdote, and facts that kept us whisked with attention all the while she was speaking. She neither scolds nor gives us baby talk, and is altogether quite difficult to get around or overcome with her cogent reasons. Her weak point is that she has no political power as men have. Here is where the man-like sneer comes in. For an American woman to ask for an equal share of that seems as preposterous to some people as it once undoubtedly did to claim her own earnings. Mrs. Hooker is another sort of a woman, one whom society has not spoiled. She talks to her audience as she might to a welcome guest at her own breakfast table, simply, earnestly, and charmingly, with a force, too, as of one's own convictions. It is a touch of the best society to hear her. That will harm none of us. Our lecture was a free one, thanks to the owners of the hall, and there should be liberality enough wherever these women hold forth to make the remaining ones so. Mrs. Hooker suggests a plan for political action this spring, entirely within the law and quite feasible, providing men are up to it. Rising statesmen who do not give these women a fair hearing may learn too late for their own purposes that a noble mind has no sex. Our Chief Justices of 25 years hence are making their record today. Yours truly, J.B. Olcott.
Thank you, Mr. Olcott. Stepping into my role now as the town historian, I'd like to speak a moment about some additional equal franchise events that took place over the course of the next 45 years. We're celebrating the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, but it took many, many years. So a lot of other activities took place in the meantime. If you're a member of the Historical Society, check your Courier newsletter. It's a listing of several of those events, including big meetings where men and women got together to try to figure out how they could bring about this change, bring about equal rights. And our next big event on the subject of the 19th Amendment is Sunday, October 27th, over at the History Center, just a few blocks from here. Mary Ann Handley will be speaking at 1 o'clock, talking about the process of getting to success with the 19th Amendment. She's flying back from Ireland today, so we weren't sure if she was going to make it. And she's not here. If she were, I'm sure she would invite you all to come to that event, October 27th. And thank you very much for coming out to hear about 1874. How about a round of applause for our characters, for our town troubadour, for our videographers, and the sound person, and the president of the Manchester Historical Society, Jack Pryor. Thank you all very much.